presentation. And it this means that you are not confident about the reason. You cannot explain. You can just use those words. Okay, you can. So, speaking in a monotone is very common. तो आप देखेंगे once you attend those lectures कि आवाज़ तब्दील ही नहीं हो रही. तो then get lost in details. You start talking about something which is very technical. In a presentation, you cannot do that. You just need to give high-level ideas, and that is it. जिस चीज़ पूरी किताब लिखी हुई है आप उसको प्रेजेंटेशन में तो नहीं बहरहाल बता सकते. Why do you want to take that risk? So you have to develop the skill of prioritizing. अभी जब आप बनाएंगे ना स्लाइड्स तो आप ये देखेंगे कि अच्छा क्या चीज़ मैं निकाल सकता हूँ. इसी वजह से we have asked you to add that video part क्योंकि वो उसका भी summarized version है. You have 3 minutes or you summarize the key messages from your finding in those 3 minutes. So that really helps you to really think कि अच्छा कम से कम टाइम में क्या सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट बात क्या है जो मैं बताऊं. तो this is the curse of technology, you can say. अभी हम we will discuss again about this memorable writing. हमने इन क्वेश्चंस के आंसर करने हैं कि एक कहानी है वो हजारों साल से सबको याद है. लाइक टॉर्टोइज एंड द हेयर, कछुए और खरगोश की कहानी एक दफ़ा सुनी थी और याद है. और यहाँ पे जिस चीज़ में आप पूरा सेमेस्टर पढ़ रहे हैं, जो पिछले सेमेस्टर में या लास्ट आपने जो भी डिग्री की थी उस क्लास में जो आप बैठे थे वो आपको चांसेस आर की याद नहीं है. तो ऐसा क्या मतलब उनमें क्या है और कि हजारों साल से ना कहीं लिखी गई थी, लोग बताते थे और याद भी है. तो वी हैव टू कम बैक टू दिस पॉइंट, how to make your ideas memorable. What are the simple things you can do to really make your writing, your presentation memorable, कि आपका मैसेज भी कन्वे हो जाए, लोगों को याद भी रह जाए. So there is this very interesting book called how to make things stick. This is the philosophy of story writing. ये कैसे हो गया कि एक कहानी है वो कहीं किसी ने बताई होगी किसी जुबान में, और अब हजारों साल गुजरे और हर जुबान में वो कहानी है. ये खरगोश और कछुए की कहानी किस जुबान में ओरिजिनेट हुई है? हर हर कल्चर में उस जैसी या एग्जैक्टली वही स्टोरी अवेलेबल है. तो ये कैसे हो गया? तो पीपल थिंक अबाउट दैट ये कैसे मतलब व्हाट हैपेंड, और हमारी जो बातें हैं जिसपे हम टाइम इन्वेस्ट करते हैं वो जो है लोग भूल जाते हैं. तो देयर आर सम सिंपल टूल्स which they have recommended. वो हम we will go through that book. That is our next part. अभी तो हम we were just going through the basics. We will come back again and we will look at all those suggestions from human psychology perspective. So again, visual aids. Okay, if you have a time limit, always finish on time. People who try to go over time, it leaves a very bad taste. It is socially considered a really bad thing. You are not adhering to your timings and you are wasting somebody else's time. तो ये जो है ना बड़ी गैर अखलाकी बात तस्वुर की जाती है. We are not very used to it. But 1 second, if you are late somewhere, people think कि ये बहुत बुरी बात है. तो 1 मिनट से क्या हो जाता है So don't do it. This is the cultural difference. For example, this is the problem we have when we travel to, let's say, countries like Germany. जर्मनी में अगर आप कहते हैं ना कि मेरी आपसे मीटिंग है 7 बजे, तो 7 बजे का मतलब ये है कि 6:59 पे आई शुड बी देयर. इफ आई एम देयर एट 7:01, तो ये बहुत गलत बात की तस्वुर की जाती है. तो वी आर नॉट यूज टू इट. हमारे लिए तो 5-10 मिनट तो मान ही नहीं ना रखते. तो क्योंकि आदत नहीं होती, तो फिर जब पहली दफ़ा आपको महसूस होता है कि ये बंदा इतना बुरा क्यों मना रहा है इस बात का, तो आपको समझ नहीं आती. उनके सोसाइटी में इस तरह है कि आपने कोई बहुत बड़ा गुनाह कर दिया. यू हैव टू सो टेक यू हैव टू कंसिडर दिस थिंग कि कोई बात नहीं, अगर मेन बात बताई और ख़त्म कर दी, एंड देन यू हैव टू कंक्लूड. और हमने ये बात की है कि लास्ट स्लाइड पे ना, इट शुड हैव टेक होम मैसेज. ज़रूरी नहीं है थैंक यू वो क्वेश्चन मार्क बना हुआ आ जाए. दैट इज़ वेरी कॉमन. The last part ये जो है very good. Now there are lots of with YouTube and social media you get to see. पहले कभी होता था कि कॉन्फ्रेंस रिकॉर्ड नहीं होती थी, होती भी थी तो अवेलेबल नहीं होती थी. तो एवरीथिंग इज लाइव ऑन फेसबुक और समवेयर. You can watch a lot of these talks to improve yourself. So never I don't expect now कि मैं कहीं प्रेजेंटेशन दूंगा और लोग जो है ना तालियां बजाना शुरू कर. That the best you can aim for के people are not bored to death when you finish giving your talk. That is the aim. So you don't need to be flashy and you don't need to use too many sound effects और जो है ना. So this is an issue, and this is the one of the challenge that is emerging recently. This is called, I think, so 3-minute thesis. You have to present your entire thesis, especially for PhD students. आप imagine करें आपने 5 साल एक चीज पे काम किया, आपको 3 मिनट में बताना है. So obviously you have to leave out details. So then इन्होंने बहुत ही squeeze कर दिया टाइम को. और these talks are available on YouTube. Now they are not technically for the research world, they are for general audience. कि आपने कोई मुश्किल बात है साइंस की, वो जनरल ऑडियंस को बतानी है. Anyways, if you look at those talks, you learn कि भाई कैसे मुश्किल बात आसान करके बताई जा सकती है. तो normally it is called 3-minute thesis या one slide thesis in one slide. एक स्लाइड में आप बताएं, समराइज करें. So if you publish in good venues, already you have gone through this exercise. वो जो पहली फिगर बनाई थी ना आपने पेपर में, you made sure कि जो आपकी major contribution है उस फिगर में हो. So even if you are working on something which is not publishable, मतलब आप you are working in your job or somewhere, it's not something that you aim to publish. Even then you should make this effort of coming up with this concept figure. तो फिर वो कॉन्सेप्ट फिगर हो या 3 मिनट हो, एक ही बात है. तो this is I think so one of the professors who arranges this, maybe I don't know Adelaide में है कहाँ पे है. तो she is talking about what are the challenges. I will just play and have just listen to her. आवाज आ रही है आपको?
Hi, I'm Inga Newburn, Director of Research Training here at the Australian National University. Today I'm going to be talking about the 3 most common mistakes I see that research students make when they're treating a thesis presentation. So the first mistake, and I think it's the most common one, is that I see students fail to connect their research with a bigger picture. They fail to tell us why we should care about their research. All research is directed towards bigger aims. So what you're doing might be one really tiny, small part of actually fixing climate change or fighting disease. And I think people are really worried about talking about these bigger issues because they concentrate so much on that little part that they're doing. So the solution that I often offer people for this problem is to try to lift themselves up and get a helicopter view of the problem. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how that might work. In one student that I worked with was working with the physics of light, and particularly with bending light with optical instruments. And we talked for a long time about how she could connect this research into bigger issues. I eventually asked her a really stupid question, really. What might your research, what could we build with your research in the future? If we imagined a whole lot of other people doing this research, following along from you, what could we build? And she came up with an invisibility cloak, and she ended up coming second in that competition. And
So they are trying to summarize, but this suggestion is only for journal talks, not for research papers. In research papers, you cannot. I mean, you just need to describe the important findings you have done. आपने अगर कोई problem solve किया है तो you can't motivate people with climate change. For example, conference ही climate change पे है तो everybody is working in that area. So if you are working with images, so you think one day robots will use. So you can't talk about robots in a robotic conference. So you have to make आपने audience को समझना होता है कि ये कहाँ ये जो suggestion है, it is valid that you need to think of कि क्या हो जाएगा. तो this might help you in maybe finding a very cool name for your paper. If you figure out कि अच्छा हम क्या problem solve कर रहे हैं तो maybe it is related to some proverb or it is related to some other important term. जिस तरह अब ये इन्होंने इनविजिबिलिटी क्लॉक का बात की है तो मैं आपको दिखाई देता हूँ. This is a recent paper from one of those conferences. तो इन्होंने basically adversarial attacks होता है कि आप कोई चीज़ ऐड करें और डिटेक्टर फूल हो जाए. इन्होंने ना इन्होंने एक बंदे को जो है ना एक शर्ट पहनाई है कि यहाँ पे स्टूडेंट्स बैठे हुए हैं, तो सारे स्टूडेंट्स डिटेक्ट हो रहे हैं एज ह्यूमन, बट ये बंदा नहीं डिटेक्ट हो रहा क्योंकि इसने शर्ट की पहनी. बेसिकली द टॉपिक इज एडवर्सरियल अटैक्स ऑन डीप लर्निंग सिस्टम्स. लेकिन इन्होंने नाम क्या रखा है? So this way you can really think and come up with something which you can remember. अब मुझे ये याद रहेगा इसका नाम, ये बाकी तो शायद मैंने ना याद रहे कि क्या लिखा हुआ था इन्होंने, ये मुझे याद रहेगा. दिस इज अ वेरी वैल्यूएबल थिंग. अगर मैं फॉर एग्जांपल आई वांट टू सर्च, मैंने कोई पेपर सर्च करना है, किसी को बताना है कितने पेपर हैं टॉपिक पे, उनमें से कौन सा बताऊंगा, जो बताऊंगा वो साइट भी करूंगा. तो it makes a very big difference that you have a very technical name or you have this catchy name. तो ये जो है ना research is like sort of started to become like a Hollywood movie कि आपने स्क्रिप्ट बनाना है और जो है ना उसको फिर मार्केट करना है और फिर so these are just skills you have to practice if you really want to make a name for yourself.
I think that really grabbed people's attention. The second example that I've got is a woman who was looking at nanoparticles, and I got really excited because I thought nanoparticles, that's immediately interesting to me. But she said that she was looking at how emulsification worked, and it turned out, if you think about emulsification, the process is shaping up salad dressing. So you've got the oil and the vinegar, and you have to shake them to make them actually mix together. She was looking at nanoparticles that would do this shaking without actually having to shake the bottle. So we ended up talking and talking about how this might connect into bigger issues. And she ended up calculating how much energy that it took to shape makeup bottles all over the world to actually make them all emulsify. And it was an amazing amount of energy. So she worked this into her presentation and talked about manufacturing processes and making them more efficient. The second most common mistake that I see students make when they're preparing the 3MT script is that they don't work hard enough to engage our curiosity in the research. Why should we care about what this research is doing? What's in it for me, is the audience asking themselves. And honestly, most students are not in the best position to really highlight what's most interesting about the research. And this is kind of curious until you think about it.
अगर आप सिर्फ प्रेजेंटेशन दे रहे हैं ना तो फिर तो आपसे गलती हो सकती है, बट इफ़ यू आर पार्ट ऑफ अ रिसर्च लैब तो ये काम आपको करना पड़ेगा, वरना आपका पेपर एक्सेप्ट नहीं होगा. When you are writing the introduction, you have to motivate people that why what you have done is important. How you have done it will come in the related work section. So this is why a researcher can be a very good salesperson. तो ये कहना कि किसी ने पीएचडी की हुई है उसको किसी बात का नहीं पता होता, इज द जर्नल इंप्रेशन ऑफ समबडी हैविंग अ पीएचडी. तो ज़्यादा उम्र का बंदा होगा और उसको सिर्फ मैथ ही समझ में आती होगी, तो उसको काफ़ी चीज़ें समझ में आती है. तो दिस इज व्हाट आई मीन, यू सी, if you if you are if you develop these skills, they will help you as a researcher and they will also help you in your daily life. तो ये रियाजत से चीज़ें आती हैं.
Like this. Students are suffering from the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is they've actually forgotten what it's like not to know what they know, and they know so much. They know so much detail about so many things to do with their research, and they've just lost sight of what's actually interesting. So sometimes when I talk to students and I talk them through composing their script,
So they are talking about curse of knowledge. और ये जो लोग ML पढ़ रहे हैं, तो they would have experienced this thing by now. जब आप लोगों ने सेमेस्टर स्टार्ट किया था ना और हम वो नियरेस्ट नेबर वाली प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व कर रहे थे, यू वर फैसिनेटेड बाय अच्छा क्या होगा नेक्स्ट. लेकिन बाय द 10th वीक, दिस इज द 10th वीक, 11th वीक कौन सा वीक है ये? 10th कब है एग्जाम? कितने दिनों बाद है? next week. Okay. So when we started discussing about these details, ये theta or alpha or lambda, so AI doesn't seem magical anymore. How many of you have experienced it? तो ये मैं नहीं कह रहा, ये again there is a online lecture from MIT, artificial introduction to artificial intelligence, जो उनके प्रोफेसर हैं ना, तो he is explaining this phenomena कि when I explain things to people, they start to appreciate the AI less. क्योंकि अब आप सीख गए हैं तो आपको तो you don't see anything interesting in it. तो लेकिन जब आपने नहीं सीखा था तो things seemed very interesting. तो ये तो this is the general trend. तो जब आप एक प्रॉब्लम पे काम करते रहते हैं ना तो you forget कि क्या चीज़ आपको इंट्रीग कर रही थी शुरू में. You have to learn this skill to build up a story. कहानी कैसे बनानी है रिसर्च से. जो ये बात कह रही है ना खातून, वो कह रही है कि ये जो एक्चुअल जो है ना, यू हैव टू बी गुड एट स्टोरी मेकिंग. और स्टोरी में ट्विस्ट होता है, तो वो जो ट्विस्ट है ना, वो सारे गलत एक्सपेरिमेंट्स हैं जो आपसे नहीं हो सके, जो आप नहीं बताना चाहते किसी को. दोज विल हेल्प यू टू बिल्ड दी स्टोरी. तो हम आएंगे उन बातों पे.
ask them to tell me what's the most unexpected thing that you found out in your research. Sometimes it takes a really long time for them to tell me. Perfect.
नो नॉट लॉन्ग टाइम. जिसने एक्चुअल रिसर्च की है ना, वो जो पहला एक्सपेरिमेंट है ना, वो जो फेल होता है ना, वही अनएक्सपेक्टेड होता है. वहीं पे जो है ना स्टूडेंट तो गिरा पड़ा होता है ना घर पे, हम फेल हो गए जी बिल्कुल ही. तो जो है ना फिर उसको जो है ना आपको उठाना पड़ता है कि भाई दिस इज पार्ट ऑफ रिसर्च एंड एरर्स आर पार्ट ऑफ रिसर्च. वो जो आप पहली एक्सपेरिमेंट है ना, वो हमने देखा मशीन लर्निंग में कि जो पहली एक्सपेरिमेंट खत्म होती है तो कहानी शुरू होती है. और जर्नल ट्रेंड ये है कि जो हमारी अपब्रिंगिंग है वो ये है कि जब एक्सपेरिमेंट ख़त्म होना तो सक्सेसफुल एक्सपेरिमेंट हो, क्योंकि हमने तो बॉलीवुड देखा होता है ना। ठीक है, तो वो क्या फिल्म थी वो जिसमें वो शाहरुख खान जो है ना वो पानी बनाता है, वो डैम सा बनाता है, कौन सी फिल्म थी वो? हमने तो वो देखी थी है ना, उसने जाया, उसने जो है ना पानी वो गया, उसने पाइप में देखा, उसने वो क्या कहते हैं पत्ते निकाले तो पानी चलना शुरू हो गया। पूरा गांव खड़ा है, किसी भी को पता है कि यार ये पत्ते निकालोगे तो पानी चल पड़ेगा। उससे ज्यादा पता है, दे आर ऑल फार्मर्स, कि भाई फंसी हुई है कोई चीज निकालोगे तो पानी चलना शुरू हो जाएगा। तो अब क्योंकि हमें उसकी आदत है तो वी आर नॉट यूज टू इट, वो जब एक्सपेरिमेंट खत्म होता है तो हम गिरे पड़े होते हैं। तो वी हैव सीन कि दीज ऑल थिंग्स दे आर रिलेटेड टू आइट्रेशंस, कि जितनी आप आइट्रेशंस करेंगे सक्सेस के चांसेस बढ़ जाएंगे। पर failed experiments are very important if you want to build up a story. What was the unexpected? You did an experiment, you were expecting something, it failed. So this failure will help you to build up the story.
Parents, maybe your siblings, maybe. But I found out some really interesting things. For instance, did you know that when you eat too much research, and they've just lost sight of what's actually interesting. So sometimes when I talk to students and I talk them through composing their script, I ask them to tell me what's the most unexpected thing that you found out in your research. Sometimes it takes a really long time for them to tell me. But I found out some really interesting things. For instance, did you know that when you eat too much silver in your diet, your tongue turns blue? And that when you're watering plants, you're not actually making the leaves plumper, you're giving the plants electrons. And when the students told me these things, I was really interested. But they were like, why are you even interested in that? That's completely obvious. And I said, well, not to me. So what's the solution to this? You really need to talk to people who have no idea about your research. I'm talking about maybe your parents, maybe your siblings, maybe people down the pub. Talk to them, tell them about your research, listen to yourself. If you can, just take yourself on your phone and and then you'll find yourself telling people all sorts of things, and you can gauge from their reaction what it is that's actually really interesting about your research that you've forgotten. The third most common problem I see is people neglecting the visual component of a 3-minute thesis presentation. It's one slide with no transition, no animation, no sound, just one slide. It sounds very difficult, and actually it is. And I think that most people get to the slide really as an afterthought, and this is a mistake. If you think about the slide as being integral to the actual presentation, you do much better. And I think our winner of the AMU final this year, Rosanna Stevens, really demonstrated that. Rosanna was talking about whiteness. So she's talking about the idea that there are white ways of doing things that we have failed to even notice anymore. And the way she demonstrated this was to have a completely blank slide. The slide itself was white. And when she presented to it, she asked us to imagine there were all sorts of things on this white slide, also in white, and we couldn't see them because they were white on white. And then later on, she moved through her presentation to ask us to imagine that this white slide covered up a black background, and then she got to the heart of her issue, which is Indigenous culture. So I thought Rosanna's presentation was really interesting because actually the first time I saw it, I thought there was a mistake. The slide deck had not actually been composed properly. And of course, that immediately made me pay more attention to her and her research. And she did very well all the way through the competition. I think the impact of this white slide was really telling. So how can you mobilise this in your visuals? Well, a lot of us don't have such an easy hook with our research and our images. So play it safe if you have to. Imagine there's a grid on your slide deck and you're lining up the images. Don't cross over the corners to try and make it more interesting. Don't fade out the edges. Just put the images on a simple grid to simple fonts. It is fonts that move between different platforms and often change their size and their orientation, and you won't know what it looks like in the final presentation. And finally, if you can't do that, find one image, one really key, impactful image that you can use. We call this the hero shot, and just put one image on your slide. The biggest mistake you can make is to just not even have a go. We all make mistakes. That's how we get better. It's how we learn. a lot of mistakes making this video. People failing to connect what their research is doing. My own research was about hand gestures, and I talked. My own research was about hand gestures, and if we.
Okay, so नस्ट में भी हुआ था, ये होता होगा, आई डोंट नो, बट देयर वाज वन स्टूडेंट, आई रिसीव्ड वन ईमेल, तो उन्होंने ना मुझे तस्वीर खींच के भेजी कि साथ वो 5,000 रुपए थे, बस तस्वीर भेजी, पैसे नहीं भेजे। तो इन्होंने कहा कि मैं कहीं गई थी, तो हमने जो प्रेजेंटेशन बनाई थी वो मैंने वहाँ दी थी, तो आई वन द प्राइज। तो शी वाज नॉट इवन लाइक प्रिपेयरिंग फॉर द this competition. She went somewhere and they were saying कौन present करना चाहता है, she participated and ended up winning because he had really spent long time preparing the paper, so you might end up winning some money as well. आप जाके पता कीजिएगा कि कहाँ हो रही है, नास्ट में कहाँ होती है ये 3